they're not part of the G7, which continues to dominate the economic landscape. And it is this attractiveness of this alternative group which is challenging the hegemony of the post-World War II global order, economic order especially, whether it is the World Bank, whether it is the IMF, whether it is the other structures that have come up. Most of these countries believe that these structures are unfair.
The world is changing dramatically. Blocs are being reconstituted, and they want to preserve their options as much as they possibly can. And so they don't want the BRICS to become the China bloc versus the Western bloc.
Globalize.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, better known as BRICS. They're holding a summit, and that's what we're talking about today. Are they just an acronym, or do they have a future, and where are they going?
This is Globalize, where we take a new look at security policy. We break it down for you so you understand how it affects your life. And today we're going to talk about the future of BRICS. I'm Isha Bhatia-Sanin. I'm senior editor at Deutsche Welle.
I'm Wayne Bluecraft, security reporter at DW. We have some great guests with you today to discuss the future of BRICS. Joining us from New Delhi, Sushant Singh. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research and a lecturer at Yale University.
And from South Africa, we have Daniel Bradlow. He is professor at Center for the Advancement of Scholarship. Welcome to Globalized.
Daniel, since you are in South Africa, where the summit is taking place, I would like to direct the first question to you, which is looking at BRICS. I'm wondering what exactly it is. It's not an alliance like NATO. It's not a bloc like the European Union. It's not really a partnership. Could you tell us, from your view, what actually is BRICS?
It's a good question. I think the closest analogy is to think of it as something like the G7 or the G20. So it's an informal grouping of countries who see some benefit in coming together in a structure that is somewhat formal, in the sense that there's an annual process where they all come together and try to develop their common interests and their common agendas. And in the case of the BRICS, that common agenda is built around building a greater voice for the global South.
Right. Let's get into that a little bit, because especially with the war in Ukraine, which has really kind of blown open these divisions between what would broadly be known as the West and broadly be known as the global South, there is this louder voice, this louder call for representing the issues of the global South in the world security order. But even within that, of course, the BRICS themselves are not really agreed on what that is. So what are the BRICS standing for? What are they advocating for?
So, I mean, particularly because Russia is a member of the BRICS, the issue of Ukraine is the big elephant in the room. It complicates the relationships, but it's not the thing that I think most of them would hope to focus on in this summit this year. I think what they do agree on is that there's problems in global economic governance, global governance more generally. They would like to see that reformed. I think once you get more specific than that, the divisions amongst them become quite significant. But they do have, and I think this is important to keep in mind, they do have two important concrete achievements. One is the new development bank, which has now been making loans for about 6 or 7 years and has been lending about 32 billion in that period. And the contingent reserve arrangement, which is a swap arrangement amongst central banks, which has not yet been used, but is there in the background to be used. And I think beyond that, the BRICS are still trying to work out exactly what they have in common and how they can collaborate more.
They're still working out, and yet there are 40 countries that have expressed interest in joining the group. So, Sushant, this is the first day of the summit when we are recording the show. And as of now, we're talking about a good 40 countries. So what is it that makes this group so attractive for so many countries out there?
So essentially, just to add to what Daniel said, the group is it's almost an oversight to the G7 in a sense. It is the countries which are big enough but not part of the G7. Whether it is China, whether it is Russia, whether it is India, it's Brazil, South Africa. These are all very big countries within their own continent, but they are not part of the G7, which continues to dominate the economic landscape. And it is this attractiveness of this alternative group which is challenging the hegemony of the post World War II global order, economic order especially, whether it is the World Bank, whether it is the IMF, whether it is the other structures that have come up. Most of these countries believe that these structures are unfair to them, and they have not allowed these countries to develop or become better. And that's why they become attractive to countries like Argentina, to Bangladesh, to Saudi Arabia, to all the non G7 countries which think that they need to be at that level but are unable to reach that level because of the disadvantages of the global order that has been in place since the end of Second World War. Just to get back to the question that you asked, Daniel, about Ukraine. So if you observe closely, actually there are not much differences between the BRICS members on Ukraine. None of them has actually condemned Russia. India has not condemned Russia. Brazil definitely hasn't. South Africa has close relationship with Russia. China, we of course know, has been very closely aligned. So actually, on Ukraine, they are much more closely aligned. Much more, if I say they are not supportive of Russia, they are not willing to go out and condemn Russia for what has happened. And there could be own reasons for it. For someone like India, it's dependence on Russian crude oil, its dependence on Russian defense supplies. It's old historic ties with the Soviet Union. For South Africa, it is old historic ties going back to the Soviet Union and the support for the ANC. For Brazil, it's a different socialist kind of a structure that they believe in. But the fact of the matter is, Ukraine is not a divisive issue at all for the BRICS countries, which it is for countries in the G20 or in other groupings.
Which is interesting you say that, because if we listen to the rhetoric, which can of course be very different than policy positions, but if we listen to the rhetoric, especially from, for example, the South African president recently at the opening of the BRICS summit, talking about the rule of law, the importance of sovereignty, the importance of territorial integrity, the importance of maintaining the UN Charter and supporting the UN, it could be interpreted as a criticism and a pushback against Russia in all but name. So I guess my question is then, is the BRICS partnership, or I should say the grouping of BRICS, any less hypocritical than the accusations that they charge of hypocrisy against the West, against the G7, and so on?
Oh, not really. All countries are hypocritical when it comes to their foreign policy and dealing with other countries. The same South Africa, whose president has gone out and said all this, did conduct military exercises with Russia very recently, or has been more than happy to go and meet President Putin or welcoming the Russian overtures, has not really been critical of Russia in Ukraine. Forget that. I can give you an example of India. Chinese soldiers are sitting on Indian territory in Ladakh. They're violating territorial integrity of India, and India is still not willing to go out and condemn a foreign pass violating another country's territorial integrity or sovereignty, for that matter. And that hypocrisy, I think, is embedded into all foreign policy actions that most countries undertake and the policies that they follow. So we should not take rhetoric more seriously than what it deserves to be taken.
And Daniel, I see you laughing there. I think you might want to add something.
The four BRICS countries, particularly Brazil, India, and South Africa, China maybe to a lesser extent, are caught in a very difficult dilemma, because they strongly believe in the UN Charter and the principles of non-interference and respect for sovereignty, and they want to uphold that. But they're also, and in that sense, they would condemn Russia. But on the other hand, they're also concerned about the role NATO has played in precipitating the war, when contributing to the exacerbation of the situation. And so they don't want to be seen as taking a side in favor of NATO against Russia as explicitly. And so they're caught on that dilemma, and they're trying to maneuver in a very small space. But part of what attracts them, and I think many of the 40 countries or thereabouts that are thinking of interested in joining the BRICS, is that they feel the world is changing dramatically. Blocs are being reconstituted, and they want to preserve their options as much as they possibly can. And so they don't want the BRICS to become the China bloc versus the Western bloc being led by the G7. And so they're trying to maneuver in a very narrow way between these different risks. And that does leave them in a position of looking somewhat hypocritical. But I think there's a consistency and a coherence underlying that a hypocriticalness that shouldn't be lost in this discussion. But as Sushant said, I mean, international relations is replete with hypocrisy, and so they're no less guilty than everybody else.
And the fact that Putin is not there present is, I think, exhibit A of how tight their room for maneuver is, because there is that international rush warrant.
And if I may add, the Indian image of Putin, or what the Indian population thinks, is very different from what the Western population thinks. Or when the invasion of Ukraine started, Mr. Modi's supporter actually put up posters in Delhi saying that what Putin has done to Ukraine, Mr. Modi will do to Pakistan. So there's huge support for Putin and Greater Russia within supporters of Mr. Modi in India. So the view the Western world has of Putin is not necessarily the view people have in South Africa or China or India or even Brazil of Putin. So that's something we should be cognizant of and recognize, actually.
And it's not just a matter of Ukraine and Russia. When it comes to expansion, all the BRICS countries, they seem to have their own interests. So there are different countries that each member state wants to have here. So if, Sushant, if you could just run us through that, which country has interest in which members, and why is that so?
So essentially, as far as I know, as far as South Africa has announced that 22 countries have formally applied, although number originally floated was somewhere around 40. And out of those 22 countries, Brazil has been particularly interested in bringing Argentina in. China and Russia have been particularly interested in bringing Saudi Arabia in, and India was focused on bringing Bangladesh in. And this was also, as Daniel mentioned, it's also related to how the BRICS Bank, now the New Development Bank, has evolved and how its membership has increased, and if those countries could come in. India was the most reluctant to actually allow an expansion of BRICS, because it believes that would give China greater power over this grouping. But because a lot of these countries which have applied are also very friendly with India, particularly countries like Saudi Arabia and Argentina and Bangladesh, it is very difficult for India to say no to them. So the Indian position now is, can we formulate some rules which would then be applied, through which people could be entered as new members of BRICS? But then the question is, do the original members themselves meet any criteria or any rules under which they became part of that grouping? And I think that's something which is still to be resolved. That contradiction, that interplay is still to be played out fully before we know who's going to be entered and what are going to be the benchmarks, the criteria on which these countries are going to enter the grouping.
In addition to that, it's not exactly clear what they're joining. Are they joining the BRICS summit process, or are they joining the New Development Bank? What exactly will they be admitted to? And just as a footnote to that, I always find it interesting that the Articles of Agreement of the New Development Bank explicitly state that the 5 original member countries will always have 55% of the vote in the bank, which means at least collectively that they would control the bank no matter how many countries join. And that, other countries willing to accept that, or is that going to have to change?
Sounds
of
like
course,
the
you can amend the
on the
treaty
Security
to
Council, which these countries would
Yeah,
like to see
exactly.
reformed.
Or the US having the veto in the IMF and the World Bank.
For example.
Also, Daniel, the fact of the matter is that the New Development Bank itself is unable to provide grants to Russia after the Western sanctions have come
Right.
in. So the New Development by itself is not a mechanism which is an answer to the World Bank or the IMF. It fails when it faces Western sanctions, and none of these BRICS countries are willing to take these Western sanctions on in that sense.
Daniel, Sushant just said that 22 countries have formally applied. Now, I'm kind of intrigued. How do you formally apply to an organization or to a club which is informal in nature?
Well, it's a very good question, because one of the 22 countries, Morocco, which South Africa had identified, has explicitly denied that they have applied. So I'm not convinced that the list of 22 formally applied versus the 20 odd countries that have informally expressed interest are necessarily really that distinguishable from each other. But I think what it really means is they've all said in some way that if invited to join the BRICS, they would be happy to join the BRICS. And it's up to the BRICS, I guess, to decide what are the criteria and who would they like to invite as the first members. I mean, the South African spokespeople, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and people in her department have said that they expect some countries are likely to be invited soon after this meeting, but a smaller group than that grouping. Which countries nobody's been saying yet, and which might be a reflection of the fact that, like India, South Africa also is somewhat, I think, concerned about the expansion, because part of the benefit of the BRICS to us is that it's an exclusive club, and that we have the benefit of meeting annually with the Prime Minister of India, the President of China, of being the African representative, so to speak, in the BRICS. The more countries that get admitted, the less exclusive the club. And for a relatively small player like South Africa, that's a cost.
This reminds me of like being at the school cafeteria where the cool kids sit, which table, who sits at which table, or the team captains on the playground picking
So
teams
just
who they
to
want.
add to just to add to the Daniel's point, actually the biggest push for expansion of BRICS is coming from China. Beijing is the one which has really pushed hard to expand the BRICS. Essentially, it sees BRICS as a modicum, as a means through which it can increase its influence, get more countries to support it, to stand alongside it. This is something which it has tried with China-Africa Summit. This is something which it has tried with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There are 16 plus 1, or 17 plus 1 now, as it is called. There are all kinds of groupings, all kinds of organizations which China is part of. And the evidence for this is that all the Chinese newspapers in the last couple of days have their front page stories about BRICS. That's very unusual. That's not true for India. That's perhaps true for South Africa because it is hosting the summit. Not true for any other country. But the Chinese media, which is completely party-controlled media, state-controlled media, has gone all out to focus on BRICS. And the Chinese ambassador to South Africa has in fact hinted, can we create a kind of an alternative to the G7 by expansion of BRICS? So while other countries for their reasons are reluctant, Chinese are really pushing very hard to expand the BRICS as a grouping.
Sushan, is that in your perspective, is that a good gamble on China's part? Does that does that run risks for their own policy interests?
I think at this point in time, they want to show that they have large number of friends because they feel isolated, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, because of the very strong US-led stance, which has got partners like India, which has got alliance partners like Japan and Australia. Then the recent meeting between Japan and South Korea, they really feel under pressure within the continent and within the Indo-Pacific. And they are trying to somehow show that they still have friends. This is something that they were trying to do with the EU when they were trying to hold these meetings with the EU. And this is something that they're again trying to show, that they still have friends, they still have partners, they still have countries which are willing to stand with them. And that's an effort this is part of that effort. Whether it will play out well for them, that only time will tell. But I think no country at this point in time wants to really offend China in that sense. It's not that the Chinese will go and punish them, but the fact is that people say, why get into trouble with them? We need to trade with them, we need to do other stuff with them. Let's just live with them. And I think that's the part of the calculation that is going on.
But then is it really BRICS challenging the US-led world order, or is it just China standing against US and trying to win friends?
I mean, I think it's not just China. The other countries do have their own interests for wanting to challenge as well. I mean, the obvious one is Russia would like to see an expansion because they truly are lacking friends, and they would like to see a grouping in which they can be accepted as a sort of leading player. But even for the other countries, there are some serious substantive concerns with the way the global economy is governed, and they would like that to be addressed and to change. And the BRICS is one of the forums. It's not the only forum that can be used for that, but it is an important forum, and particularly because China's there. And on economic issues, China shares the concerns of the other countries about the governance of the global economy. In the UN setting, it's a little bit more complicated because of the P5 arrangements. But on the global economy issue, I think there's a much bigger agreement on the needs for change, on the fact that the World Bank, the multilateral development banks are very slow in the way the lead time required for projects, the kinds of things that would be funded, the way the West is pushing the discussion in those banks. And so there is some genuine issues which not only the five BRICS, but many of the other countries in the global south would like to see discussed as well.
And as far as China's growing influence is concerned, India likes to see itself as a big brother in global south. How is India going to react, Sushant?
Oh, absolutely. This is a huge controversial point within India. The fact that Prime Minister Modi could be standing alongside President Xi or could be having a bilateral meeting with him is a huge political controversy in India at this point in time. As I said earlier, because of the border crisis that we have had for last 3 years, there's been no bilateral meeting between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, and there's been huge pressure on Mr. Modi to undertake some actions so that the Chinese vacate the territories that they have occupied since 2020. And if Mr. Modi were to meet President Xi, is he going to be able to press Mr. Xi to vacate these areas where the PLA has come into the Indian territory? And even otherwise, the Indians do not want an Asia where China is the big hegemonic power. Indians are also worried about the fact that China dominates bilateral trade with them. China dominates the geopolitical landscape in South Asia. Some of these countries of South Asia, which are India's neighbors, whether it is Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, they were all very friendly with India, but more and more they're becoming very friendly with China. And that's the kind of challenge India is constantly facing from China. And India does not want China to get that kind of hegemonic influence. And that's why it has reactivated the Quad with the United States, Japan, and Australia 3 years back. And so there's a principal contradiction here that is playing out between India's membership of the Quad, under which there are annual summits, and India's membership of BRICS, which is completely opposed to the Quad countries. So India is riding in two boats at the same time. And if these boats really move in opposite directions very fast, India could fall in the middle.
So, would India block the expansion?
India is kind of saying India is using a kind of bureaucratic technique to block the expansion by saying, let's first formulate the rules. Once we all agree on the rules, see which countries qualify under those rules and then go for expansion. It's not saying, oh, we don't want to expand. It's just putting this bar on it. What India has clearly said no to is a BRICS currency, which I think Russians were proposing, that there should be a BRICS currency under which trading should take place. Indians have said that it should be rather, currencies of these BRICS countries could be used within these countries rather than a formalized BRICS currency. That clearly the Indians have said no to.
Daniel, I think you wanted to say something.
No, I would agree. I mean, I think South Africa has also said that a BRICS currency is off the table for this summit. I think South Africa, in a way, is in a more difficult position because it wants the summit to look like a success. And in some ways, whether coming up with a list of criteria for countries to join would be one way South Africa could say this summit was a success, even if they don't announce exactly who the countries are that should join. But it's such a high-profile issue that South Africa, I think, has to be able to show some advance on the issue in order for the summit to be a success. And the criteria, I mean, in a way, it's kicking the can down the road, but it's kicking it in a way that there's something in the can that you're kicking down the road.
So it seems that there's a lot of internal work for them to figure out. Forget about the G7 and how the US will respond, and if they can, achieve these grand objectives of rebalancing the financial and security orders in the world, that there's just internal disagreements to sort out. And as Sushant, as you pointed out, India's in both boats. I like that turn of phrase there. South Africa is also, in a way, trying to play both ends. Do you see that this sort of ambiguous, trying to play both, hedging, fence sitting, whatever you want to call it, is this a sustainable foreign policy for these countries? Maybe, Daniel, you want to take that first.
I mean, it's true. There's a lot of internal issues, but I don't think that's that unusual. I mean, if you went to the G7, there's internal disagreements on some issues there as well. They have to negotiate and try come up with coherent positions, and I think that's what's happening here. I think the other issue where there is general agreement is to try and promote trade amongst the countries and to promote trade in local currency or in the currencies of the BRICS countries. Everybody understands that that's not going to lead to de-dollarization anytime soon. It's not going to lead to a BRICS currency, but countries having more options, so that if South Africa is trading with India, for example, it could use the rupee in those trades. is giving South Africa and India more options in their trade, and that's a plus for everybody. So that there are some things that, you know, there will be disagreements, but there can also be some significant positive outcomes out of this as well.
Sushant.
Yeah, so actually, the big fault line within the BRICS internally, despite the differences that many countries in any grouping would have, as Daniel rightly said, is actually India and China. India's insecurities and worries about China's rise and China's hegemony, and its seeing itself as a strategic challenger to China's rise and close partnership with the United States, make it very difficult for India to concede anything which would make China come out stronger or looking better. And that's something which we are seeing play out in the current BRICS summit. And that's something we have to recognize, that there is a big fault line between these two countries. For all the nice things that the Indian Foreign Secretary or the Indian Foreign Minister may try and say about the summit, they are not going to allow anything to take place which is going to make China come out stronger or looking better.
I just want to come back to the point Daniel had made. I know there's a lot of talk about de-dollarization. You just talked about countries trying to have trade with local currencies. I know India's pushing a lot for this to happen. For a layman to understand, how is this really going to happen?
I mean, it's not impossible. It can happen informally. I mean, I could sell you goods from South Africa to Germany and say, you could pay me in Indian rupees right now. So there is talk of creating more of a payment mechanism that would facilitate this, so that you don't have to go through a third currency to convert rands to dollars or euros and then into rupee, that you could do that directly. So there are ways to facilitate this. It's not easy. I mean, it's true, the BRICS countries count for about 20% of global trade, but that means 80% is not accounted for by the BRICS. And many of the goods and services that a country like South Africa buys is coming from non-BRICS countries, and there they're going to have to use dollars or euros or some other currency. And so that this is at the margins in some ways. I mean, 20% is not insignificant, but it's not the majority of South Africa's or any of the BRICS countries trading. And also, if you look, most of the BRICS trade is really with China, which means it's the yuan that's going to be the major currency that's used. But that's, you know, you're creating more options for countries in terms of their trade, in terms of where they keep their reserves to some extent. But it still means the dollar is going to be the dominant currency that they're using for all intents and purposes.
There are two other issues here, actually. One is, and I've seen this with India because India recently allowed 16 countries to trade in rupees. The one big problem is, how do you decide what the exchange rate is going to be if it is not going to be determined by dollar or euro or some kind of a basket? And the second issue is, which Daniel rightly brought out, there's all these countries have huge trade deficits with China. So essentially, what do? You actually will garner only yuan if you're going to do it. And how are you going to use those yuan? And let's not forget that China actually allows trading in yuan with 110 countries. So it's not that China is going to do something new. And the dollar still continues to dominate despite that. And that would remain a huge challenge. So what we would see, my apprehension is that we would see a lot of tokenism here, that you will do, a bit of a trade. Let's say you will buy $100 billion worth, or whatever, $100 billion worth of goods and pay them in rupees, and then say, oh, we paid them in rupees, and they will pay in rands. But would the whole trade shift towards domestic BRICS currencies? Very unlikely. That's not going to happen. It's going to be a huge challenge to undertake that exercise.
And to your earlier point about India, that only feeds India's insecurities about the rise of China and China's hegemonic position there when it comes to Chinese currency and Chinese trade deficits.
Oh, yes, absolutely. India actually did not allow its public sector government-owned oil companies to pay Russia in yuan. It flatly refused. It said, no, you can't pay Russian oil companies in yuan. You can pay them in dirham, you can pay them in dollars, you can pay them in euros, but not in yuan. So India's insecurities about China are very much there. And there is democratic political pressure domestically on Mr. Modi and any Indian government or any Indian prime minister that you should not do anything which would strengthen China.
And then if we are talking about this goal of trading more among BRICS countries, in their national currencies. Then we have the question of the role of Russia and the potential liability that Russia plays here. And if you're, it's almost in an ironic sense, given the U.S. sanctions and the domination of the dollar, Russia becomes a liability. Does it? Does it not, Sushant?
Absolutely. Russia is a huge challenge. India has been struggling with making payments to Russia. I do not know if you are aware of this, but Indian defense supplies and India, almost 80% of India's weapons and military platforms, defense platforms come from Russia, are of Russian origin or of Soviet origin. And most of these platforms India is unable to get spare parts, unable to get ammunition from Russia because India is unable to make payments. Already bills worth more than $3 billion are pending with India, and it's a huge challenge for India how to deal with it. India is also worried. Indian banks are worried that if they were to make any transactions to Russia, which cross the limit of $60 per barrel of crude oil, there would be Western sanctions on these banks. So, in a certain sense, it is imitating what India was already facing with Iran because of the Western sanctions, and those are the kind of challenges now that are coming up with Russia as well.
So, Daniel, from
Yeah.
everything that I've heard in the last half an hour, I understand India and China are at loggerheads. Russia wanted a common currency, others don't. Brazil and South Africa, they want expansion, India does not. I mean, all the member countries, they have different opinions, they differ politically, militarily, economically. I'm still trying to understand, that's where we started. What is it that's holding them together?
Well, I mean, trade between the countries has grown over the life of the BRICS. So that's one thing that holds them together. The institutions, the New Development Bank and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement are another. There are talks of other sorts of collaborative projects like that that could be another possibility. The other thing, and I don't think this should be totally dismissed, is the fact that the countries meet and talk at an annual level, and that they meet often on the sidelines of the G20, does build closer cooperation between them and does help them understand each other and exploit opportunities that exist between them. So that, in addition to the summit, the Business 20 are meeting this week. There have been other groups like think tanks, etc., that meet, and those growing connections between the countries is helping them to become a more forceful voice. The fact that everybody in the world is watching what's happening in South Africa this week at the summit is an indication that they've grown to the point where at least they've become a talking shop where people want to be and where they see the value in interacting with each other. And in international affairs, building international relations is a value in itself.
So, do you see BRICS more as an economic grouping or a political one?
I think it's both. I mean, I think it's hard to separate the two, but I think it's both a political and an economic grouping. And I think in some ways the economic one is easier to advance than the political one because of, as Sashant said, the tensions that are there. And as you said, those tensions are very real. I mean, India and China is not going to be easily resolved. And I don't think the BRICS is going to be the forum in which that does get resolved. So that politically the tensions are there. But hopefully the BRICS can at least contribute in some way to mitigating some of those tensions. And possibly, I mean, India, Brazil, China, Brazil, South Africa have all proposed peace arrangement, peace options in the Ukraine conflict. And maybe there's a way that BRICS can over time begin to play a role in resolving conflicts like that. But it's going to take a while still, I think, to get to that point.
That's a good segue into something I'm interested in, which is how this looks at the ground level in an everyday sort of way. Let's say that BRICS at some point gets to achieve its goal of rebalancing the world order, making it less US and Western focused. What does that look like for people in India, for people in South Africa? How does that change their lives?
Sashant, you want to go first?
It's an impossible question to answer. Like really, the lives would not really change on the face of it in that sense. But what we are saying here is that the state-to-state relationships, whether in terms of security partnerships, whether in terms of trade partnerships, whether in terms of very strong diplomatic engagements, those would definitely increase, and those influences, those partnerships, will eventually start impacting how lives are being lived. I don't think it means that the cultural influence of Hollywood or Netflix would go away. No, that's not going to go away in any of these countries. Those films will still continue to remain popular. Those series will OTT platforms will still continue to remain. Streaming platforms will continue to remain as popular. What we are going to see is probably more mutual trading arrangements, more security arrangements, more diplomatic partnerships, more friendly ties, more people-to-people contacts, and slowly over a few decades, if not a few years, we are going to see the difference in how influences uh, are exchanged between these two countries, how cultures are shared, and how things move on. It's not going to be an immediate impact that BRICS is going to come tomorrow and suddenly, Daniel is going to speak in Hindi and I'm going to speak in Swahili. No, that's definitely not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I mean, I think there are some cultural, there are more, for example, more students going to study from South Africa to China to India. People are learning the languages slowly. I'm probably too old to become fluent in Hindi, but maybe my grandchildren will take advantage of that opportunity. But so I think there are we will see some changes. The trade and the economic relations. I mean, for example, President Xi, because he's come for the summit, is having a state visit with President Ramaphosa, and they are signing a number of bilateral agreements. Now, of course, that could have happened without BRICS, but the fact that BRICS summit is happening facilitates that. And I'm sure there are going to be bilateral meetings between many of the other leaders that will also lead to things that might not have happened in the absence of a summit process. And I always say with the summit, you've got to remember that there are dozens of meetings that have taken place over the last year between different ministers, different groupings, that are where things have happened, and where over time those sorts of connections can lead to some real benefits for people on the ground. I mean, we shouldn't forget the other way in which South Africans, or people in Johannesburg at least, are going to know that there's a summit, is that there's something like 40 heads of state visiting Johannesburg this week, and traffic is going to be a huge issue for some of the people in Johannesburg.
Sushant.
No, I just wanted to tell, because Daniel spoke about what BRICS has become. Let's not forget, it started as an acronym. That's what it was. It was nothing more than an acronym. And what we clearly have now is much, much more than what it started with. It has not reached the level of the G7 or NATO or any of those very close-knit groupings. But it is much more than the acronym that it started with, which Jim O'Neill gave.
Right. And my last question would be, will we see more of an anti-West rhetoric if BRICS were to expand and if theoretically countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia were to join the group?
I think the answer depends on which countries join. I mean, if it's Iran, Belarus, and Venezuela, the outcome will be very different from if it's Argentina, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia that are the new members. And at this point, we don't know. I mean, Saudi Arabia seems to be on everyone's list of countries to join, but which of the other countries join is harder to know. But I think, in part, the rhetoric is likely to have an anti-Western tinge to it, whatever the substance beneath that is, just because of the politics and the global South focus and the frustration in the global South against the West because of the way it's handled COVID, climate, as well as Ukraine.
No, I agree with Daniel. Actually, it's not going to be directly anti-US rhetoric. It's going to be more about changing the power structures, changing the economic structure, changing the landscape on which these countries are currently operating. That's how it's likely to play out.
And then I think the corollary question is, what is the response from the United States and from Western institutions? Is it play along, try to beat them, can't beat them, join them? What is the response?
Well, I would hope it would be a more constructive response, to say that because I think most people in the world think the current arrangements for governing the global economy are not working well. Our way of dealing with the important issues facing humanity is suboptimal, and that the BRICS you might not agree with everything that they suggest, but they're an important voice proposing some new ideas, and that the West should be constructive in responding and saying, we need a dialogue. We don't agree with you on everything, but let's sit down and have a constructive discussion about how we can better deal with this, and what we, the West, need to contribute in order to deal with this, because we know many of these problems have their roots in the West in various ways.
I hope the West does what Daniel wants it to do, but considering if you travel to DC once, then the opinions that exist about Russia and China, that is extremely unlikely to happen. Any grouping which has Russia to China has got no chance of any traction getting any traction at all in any of the Western capitals.
And as Sushant, as you said at the top of our recording, rhetoric and policy positions are very different things, can often contradict one another and seem very hypocritical.
Yeah, that's it. So I think we've touched upon a lot of topics. We've tried to understand not the summit, but BRICS, what's happening, what could be the future of BRICS. Thank you so much for your time and for giving us the insights.
And we'll talk again the next summit, maybe.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was fun talking to you.
Thanks. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. That was Sushant Singh, Senior Fellow at Center of Policy and Research, CPR, and lecturer at the Yale University.
And from the University of Pretoria's Center for Advancement of Scholarship, Professor Daniel Bradlow joining us in South Africa. Such a substantive conversation from two experts who really know their stuff on BRICS, even if BRICS itself maybe is not so clear on what it is.
And there are a lot of open-ended questions, like what is going to happen? Are people really going to join in? If they are going to join in, what's the criteria going to be like? We don't know anything. There's a lot of disagreement. And as Sushant said, India might want to block it, but in a diplomatic manner.
And at the same time, South Africa, no matter what comes out of this summit, is going to want to have something in the hand to show this was a success. We were a good host. And BRICS is a success going forward.
That's right. So we're recording this on the first day of the summit. Let's see what happens by the end of the week. If you are watching us on YouTube, do let us know your thoughts. What do you think is going to be the future of BRICS like? We'll be reading your comments, and we'll see you next time with another episode of Globalize. This is Isha Bhatia-Sanan, Senior Editor here at Deutsche Welle.
And Wayne Wilcroft, Security Reporter at DW.
Signing off.
Globalize, a new take on security policy by DW.